folks, I'm Griffin Lucier. I'm here with another Jund Midrange and Historic video. Today we are looking at a Sign in Blood Lurrus build of Jund Midrange. So it's a little bit different than the last couple of ones, but it's been a while since I've posted one of these on YouTube. But it's a lot of the same stuff though too. We've still got Cheville and Scavenging Ooze as kind of our 2-drop creatures here, and Cheville plus removal spells is still going to be really solid against any of the aggro decks. Scavenging Ooze, really good at keeping your life total high, good graveyard hate, and we've got Bloodthirsty Adversary as another creature here to try to play a little bit of like the Goblin Dark Dwellers type of game. But it all fits within the Lurrus shell. So the Lurrus package makes it so you can't play some things like Planeswalkers or Seeker's Chariot or Bonecrusher Giant, but Lurrus itself is a pretty powerful card, probably worth playing. And one of the things I like about this deck is that it's got Sign in Blood, as it's kind of like, we don't have any Planeswalkers, we don't have a lot of cards that get us through our deck very fast, except for Sign in Blood, and it works pretty nicely with Lurrus because all of your stuff is really cheap, so you have plenty of time to cast the stuff you draw off of Sign in Blood, and you're able to get to the board quickly and keep your life total high, which makes it so that the 2 life lost isn't as big of a deal as it might be in other decks. And then it also pairs really nicely with the Bloodthirsty Adversary. It gives you a little bit more of a diverse selection of cards to try to flash back with the Bloodthirsty Adversary. So for removal spells, of course, we got the 4 Thoughtseize. Playing with like 1 Play It with Fire, 4 Bloodchief's Thirst. This has been my go-to ever since it's come out. Just really versatile, cheap when you need it to be, versatile when you need it to be. Inscription of Ruin is just basically like the best thing you can be doing with a Bloodthirsty Adversary deck. It either gets back an adversary, and then you get to flash back the same inscription that you use on the adversary to make your opponent discard 2 cards, to get back a different creature, to kill a creature. And it's nice that it works so well with the adversary, and it's a card that can trigger Cheville. So you want to keep your count of cards that can trigger a Cheville pretty high as well. And then Maelstrom Pulse and Kolagons come in, just kind of some catch-all cards here. And now, most of the time I've been playing this deck, I've been playing Abundant Harvest. But Abundant Harvest and Sign in Blood don't go in the same deck very well. Abundant Harvest really wants you to have green mana on turn 1 and a low land count. And so Sign in Blood requires you to have double black as early as turn 2, which is really tough to do in a 3-color deck, so what you have to do is play a lot of land. We're playing 26 here. 26 land. So what that means is Abundant Harvest gets a little bit worse because you're not going to run into these situations where you need to draw land off the top very often. So I think Abundant Harvest likes to be in a deck with a low land count instead of a high land count. So having said that, if we have to up our total number of lands in order to get our total number of black sources high enough to play Sign in Blood, and then also on top of that play the other 2 colors in the deck, we need to play a lot of lands that are utility lands so that we have a little bit of flood insurance. And so we've got 2 Lair of the Hydra and 2 Hive of the Eye Tyrant. Really good creature lands. The best scenario is when you have 1 of each in play. So sometimes you want to activate your Lair, sometimes you want to activate your Hive. So on top of that, we've also got 2 copies of Barrenmoor, which is like a little bit like an Abundant Harvest because it's either a land that enters the battlefield tapped, kind of like Abundant Harvest is, or you can cycle it. But what's nice is that it works pretty well with Witherbloom Command. Witherbloom Command is a card that is I think pretty good at the moment. Like, you have a lot of creatures with 1 toughness. You have a lot of permanents that cost 2 or less, being like Trail of Crumbs or Portable Hole or Search for Skanta or Witch's Oven. A lot of 1 toughness creatures, and then also like gaining some life in order to facilitate your Sign in Bloods and your Thoughtseizes and your Shocklands. That's always a little bit useful. Sometimes, like, you are in a situation where your opponent doesn't have any cards in their hand, but you're just trying to clock them as quick as you can so they can't draw into something good. And so 2 damage matters too sometimes. So it's a pretty versatile card, and it works pretty well in this deck because A, we're looking for things that trigger Cheville and do other things. That's why Inscription of Ruin and Kolaghan's Command are so good, is because they're useful at doing other things but can trigger a Cheville. Witherbloom Command also is good in this deck because, like, you know, getting back Baron more, that's like the best case scenario. But on top of that, we have, when you play 26 lands, you're more likely to hit a land than if you play a lower land count kind of deck. 26 lands is going to be, most of the time when you blind flip, you know, try to mill over 3 cards, you don't have a land in your graveyard. Most of the time you're going to be able to hit. And so that's a little bit of mana fixing, right? You might flip over like a red source that you needed or whatever. So that's pretty nice. Lots of times it works to get back like a Lair of the Hydra or Hive of the Eye Tyrant that got hit with a Field of Ruin or some other land destruction spell. So that's nice. And then on top of that, you've just got the Baron Moor, which turns it into from getting a land into getting a card that cycles. So putting all that together, Witherbloom Command, it's not like a huge part of the deck or anything, but it is a nice little utility spell here. Gives you lots of options. That's kind of what we're looking for. The sideboard of this deck, of course, we've got the Lurrus. We're looking for cards that fit the Lurrus shell, but also go well with Bloodthirsty Adversary. So we've got 3 copies of Cleansing Fire, 3 copies of Crush the Weak, and 3 copies of Go Blank. These are, in the matchups that you want them in, they are very, very good. Cleansing Wildfire against the 5-color Niv-Mizzet decks is pretty lights out, but when you cast it again with Bloodthirsty Adversary, then it becomes like incredibly good. Same thing is true with Go Blank against something like Izzet Phoenix or any of the control decks. When you're casting that again out of your graveyard, it turns from good to really, really good. And the fact that you've got this adversary to flashback these like super powerful cards is, and like, you know, super powerful like targeted cards, just makes them a lot stronger. When you draw 1 Cleansing Wildfire, but you get two copies of it to cast on your opponent, then you're getting that effect, you know, more than once, but still you've only spent 3 of your sideboard slots on the Cleansing Wildfire. So Bloodthirsty Adversary, when you set your sideboard up for it, starts to look really good. In addition, we've got the 4th Cheville, because sometimes you're in a matchup where, like a lot of matchups, where if Cheville sticks and is able to kind of dominate the battlefield, like, you're just going to win. So I don't mind too much about the legend rule, so I'm happy to go up to a 4th copy. That's against stuff like Gruul, against stuff like Selesnya humans, basically any aggro deck. I want Cheville number 4. We've got 1 copy of Outland Liberator. This is just kind of a nice little utility creature that works nicely with Lurrus, but there are a lot of decks like the Jund Food, Jund Sacrifice kind of decks, and even there's an Enchantress deck in Historic right now that Outland Liberator is really good with because of Lurrus, like getting a disenchant effect every single turn with Lurrus in the late game turns out to be really good. And we've got 1 copy of Valki, God of Lies, just because as far as like over-the-top mid-range kind of bomb cards go, it's tough to find one that fits within a Lurrus shell. Like, I can't play, you know, Liliana Dreadhorde General or, you know, some big Planeswalker or some big creature like that, you know, Tovolar's Huntmaster. You can't play that when you play Lurrus. So Tibalt Cosmic Imposter is kind of the best version of that we have access to. And but the other thing is that, you know, lots of times there's a matchup where Valky's really good. There are a lot of like green and white decks that don't have a ton of removal spells. So sometimes you cast a Valky and you get to just steal something out of their hand for good. So there are plenty of matchups where Valky, the 2-drop, is just a perfectly fine card to cast. And then to round it out, just a couple more copies of Fatal Push. In an aggressive matchup, you're just trying to really maximize on your, when you're going up to 4 Chevils, trying to maximize on your removal spells, trying to lower your mana curve to keep up with your opponent. And so I like to just bring in a couple of Fatal Push when I'm playing against a really fast aggro deck. So I recorded 5 matches with this deck, and I gotta be honest with you, this is the second time that I've recorded this voiceover part because I just didn't have my microphone on the first time, so this will be fun. But yeah, we'll go over the 5 matches that I recorded with this and see how it goes. Okay, so for the first game here, this is a hand that is like a little loose. These they call them the slow lands, the dual lands from Midnight Hunt. They are really great in this deck, but you end up having a lot of hands like this where you have basically you have to decide if you want to play it on turn 1 or play it later. But we have enough 1-mana stuff with this hand, you know, the Thoughtseize, the Bloodchief's Thirst, that we can afford to play our Overgrown Tomb untapped on turn 1. And then if we have to, play the slow land there on the second turn. And of course, like, the longer you wait to play that slow land, the better chance there is that you'll be able to play it untapped later on, because if you draw a land, like we did the Blightstep Pathway here, now we're off to the races. Now we can play it untapped. We have 3 mana on turn 3. We had all of our lands come into play untapped this whole game. So that's exactly what you want to see when you're trying to keep up with like a very fast start like this. This is a deck that, or an opponent who has a hand that's like, would have been very good if we didn't have an answer to that Mayhem Devil. So at this point, like, to me this looks like a version of the deck that has Bolas' Citadel, with the Innkeepers, the Shambling Ghasts. It looks like, to me, that they are trying to just like ramp up to as much mana as possible, cast the Bolas' Citadel, and then use the Prosperous Innkeepers to just cast a ton of stuff off the top of their library. So we're just going to try to get as many Cheville triggers as we can, try to get rid of as many of these Innkeepers as we can, and eventually try to close out the game. We'll have to draw some creatures, of course, but try to close out this game before they can get a Bolas' Citadel onto the battlefield, or at least put them at a low life total so they don't have a ton of flexibility with a Bolas' Citadel. So that's the goal, but we need to draw some creatures. Cheville is good at stabilizing a board, but not good at pressuring an opponent. So our opponent here is doing something kind of interesting. They're using their Phyrexian Tower to just sacrifice whatever we target with our Cheville upkeep trigger, and makes it so that we're not able to get the Cheville, you know, the value. An interesting strategy. I could see it being the right thing to do, but I mean, that's, I guess, if that's your option to try to beat a Cheville, then Cheville's doing a pretty good job. The opponent here could double block this Bloodthirsty adversary and like make a treasure plus trade with the adversary, but they choose not to. And now we're trying to just like, they have a bunch of mana, At any point, they can use a Shambling Ghast to sacrifice to Phyrexian Tower, make a treasure, get up to enough mana to play Bolas' Citadel if they draw it. So we want to try to close this game out as quick as possible. So that's one of the nice things about the creature lands here, the Lair of the Hydra and the Hive of the Eye Tyrant, is that, like, we don't have that many creatures. Like, you always have Lurrus, of course, but ways to actually end the game are Scavenging Ooze and Bloodthirsty Adversary. Cheville kind of doesn't even count, right? And so if you don't draw any of those, but you put yourself into a situation where you're like, well, I just need to race as fast as I can, but you've only got a few creatures, then that can be kind of tough. So having these creature lands around where it's like, okay, we've got the board stabilized, but I do need to end the game quickly. Like, we're putting quite a bit of pressure on right now. In past iterations of this deck, I played a lot of Castle Locthwain, but I think that since the creature lands, the Lair of the Hydra and Hive of the Eye Tyrant have come out, like, I think that these are just a little bit more powerful, and also, like, I don't have to worry about playing, like, a bunch of swamps anymore to get my Castle Locthwain off the battlefield untapped. I mean, Lair of the Hydra, Hive of the Eye Tyrant, they come into play untapped all the time, of course, but, like, at least you can kind of depend on them coming into play untapped and getting to, you know, not slowing down your development early in order to get your creature lands into play. So here comes Crush the Weak. Crush the Weak's super good against any deck that's going to have, like, little cheap creatures like that, you know. And what else have we got? Outland Liberator, of course, a great answer to, like, Bolas' Citadel, but you don't know if they might have Trail of Crumbs or Witch's Oven or something along those lines. And I do like to go up to the 4th Cheville in this kind of matchup, just trying to use our removal spells. Keep their creatures off the board, like their Mayhem Devils, Woe Striders, that stuff like that is pretty dangerous. So this is a hand that's a little sketchy because we don't have any real, like, disruption. Inscription, like, this hand looks pretty bad, but we've got a couple of things going for us. One is that Ooze is going to be pretty good against any, like, graveyard shenanigans that they have. I don't know if this deck is going to play Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familiar. I think it might not, if it's the version that I think it is. But if they have some kind of graveyard stuff going on, the Scavenging Ooze is going to be pretty good against it. Clothis is another card that is shut down by Scavenging Ooze pretty nicely, so glad to have it here. And then Inscription, like, it's just going to be really good against, like, Mayhem Devil, or at least, like, is an answer to Mayhem Devil. And I think that's pretty important to have. So Crush the Weak was a great draw for us. Opponent kind of walked right into it there. Now, we're in Platinum in the ladder, right? Because it just turned into December here, so the season ended. And so is, like, you know, when your opponent foretells a card in a black, red, and green deck, and then you just kind of put a bunch of creatures onto the board, I don't know if that's going to happen, like, a lot, depending on how high up on the ladder you are, and, you know, depending on if your opponent can kind of, like, figure out what you're doing. But even still, like, a Crush the Weak for 3 mana there would have been totally fine. And so here's another thing about Bloodthirsty Adversary that's kind of nice, is that, like, the Clothis over there is shutting down our ability to, like, utilize the graveyard at all. Don't really expect to have any situation where I've got instants and sorceries hanging out, much less, like, the one that I want to play with, or whatever, you know? It's not like... So, if that's the case, then it's like, let's just play these Bloodthirsty Adversaries as 2/2 haste creatures, you know? Like, that's your worst case scenario is 2 mana 2/2 haste, then it's a pretty nice card in a matchup like this. When your opponent has Clothis or Rest in Peace or something like that, you can still just turn it into a perfectly fine, usable card. So the Ooze is doing a good job of countering this Clothis. All of our mana is lining up pretty nicely here. Yeah, so just getting those 2/2 creatures, these two unkicked Bloodthirsty Adversaries into play, really cut our opponent's clock, or I guess increased our own clock, I guess, by quite a bit, so we didn't give them very many turns to draw a Bolas' Citadel, and if they had drawn a Citadel, then they wouldn't have had very much life points to play around with it. So... Pretty nice game there. Everything just kind of fell together there for us. And let's go to the second match. Okay, match number 2 here. Okay, so looking at a hand here, we're on the draw. It's a little sketchy. So the Overgrown Tombs are going to make us lose some life. The Sign in Blood is going to make us lose some life. We're on the draw. We don't have any play that really affects the board. I mean, I could play a 2/2 haste Bloodthirsty Adversary on turn 2 if I really felt like it. But we're attacking our own life total. We don't really affect the board very nicely. But there are a lot of matchups where this is going to be like a great hand, you know, against like some kind of control deck or something. We have tons of card advantage in it. Of course, the opponent has Mountain into Soulscar Mage, which is like the worst thing you can see when your hand is like kind of slow, kind of card advantage centered, and also you're attacking your own life total. But we drew Bloodsheath Thirst off the top, which is about perfect. I think if we hadn't done that, we'd just getting run out of the gym this game. But what's nice about the Adversary, though, is that like they don't do very much. I mean, you know, they're basically 5-drops here. But like as long as we can hang on for a while, then we're going to be in pretty good shape to close out the game. Of course, you know, if we're just going to draw perfects all the time, then let's go ahead and snag this Cheville. And so the opponent's going to, if I remember right, the opponent attacks here. Sometimes you want to block, sometimes you don't. I don't know. I felt like I really wanted to get this trigger by, you know, casting this Inscription of Ruin. But you do, I mean, against like a mono red deck, you can expect some stuff like Skewer the Critics, possibly. Light up the stage, maybe, especially in a deck of like Soulscar Mage, you know. So it's not always the right thing to do to take that damage there. Sometimes you want to just go ahead and get your 2-for-1 because they're going to use a burn spell on it. But as it turns out, glad I didn't block. They didn't have anything, you know, too terrible. Chandra Dressed to Kill, looking pretty good here. but it was not the worst thing that could have happened. And so now it's a little bit of a interesting decision. Do I want to Sign in Blood plus play a Bloodthirsty adversary and then use that adversary to attack the Chandra Torch of Defiance? Or Bloodchief's Thirst the 4 Loyalty Chandra over there. Again, it's like the later, like you want to get on the board, but these adversaries, the later you cast them, the longer you hang on to them, the more powerful they're going to be. Like, we're putting more of a diversity of stuff into our graveyard to flash back. We are potentially even going up to 8 mana to be able to flash back 2 cards and make it a 4/4. So if you can get by without casting them as 2-drops, then it turns out to be pretty good. So now we've got 2 options available to us. We can either pulse the Chandra, which is nice because it puts a pulse in the graveyard to get flashback with the adversary. Or we do this play, get an adversary onto the board, nuke that Chain Whirler, pressure the Chandra. So now they have to try to do something to protect the Chandra. Chandra is at a low enough life total, low enough loyalty that it can't really protect itself very well. So that all went just about as well as we could hope here. And now we can pulse we didn't really have anything good to flash back anyway with the adversary, so might as well just pulse. And now we have a Maelstrom Pulse in the graveyard. And now this Bloodthirsty adversary is going to be able to hit the Chandra with that pulse. So we're in a pretty good spot here. Life total is high enough that these Sign in Bloods might come in handy anyway. Torbrand off the top. Looks pretty nice here for the opponent. Could have cast Sign in Blood. I don't know. Maybe it was the right thing to do. When the opponent has Ramunap Ruins over there, and then like burn spells start to look really bad too, it's like, you know, what do we? It looks pretty dangerous. But we drew into Bloodthirsty Adversary. Another reason why Bloodthirsty Adversary is great is that, like, you know, we are trying to trigger this Cheville. If we trigger this Cheville, we should be golden. You know, we're going to be able to attack with the Lurrus. We're going to be able to gain 3 and draw a card off the Cheville. So our life total is going to be fine if we get a chance to trigger the Cheville. So Bloodthirsty Adversary being another card that's like, you know, it's a threat, but it's also a card that triggers Cheville is another, you know, way that this list kind of works here for us, but we don't have a way to get rid of the Torbrand yet. We're going to have to cast the adversary, use its ability to get back a Bloodchief's Thirst, and then pay the kicker on the Bloodchief's Thirst, which is an 8 mana play. And luckily our opponent didn't have Goblin Chain Whirler there. That would have actually just killed us. That would have been insane. But only gave him one turn to try to draw that. And so, this is something that you run into when you play a lot of cards like Thoughtseize and Sign in Blood, is that like a lot of the matchups you run into are fine. Like, I would gladly trade my life points for how cheap and efficient these cards are. Sign in Blood, drawing 2 cards for 2 mana. Thoughtseize, of course, super efficient. But in this matchup, like, affecting your hand quality and your opponent's hand quality isn't really what's as important, and then B, your life total is very important. So when I build a deck that's got this, and I do this in Modern too, I try to, like, when I'm playing against Burn, I try to have enough cards in my sideboard that are just like somewhere between reasonable and good against Burn, so I can board out stuff like Thoughtseizes and Sign in Bloods. In Modern would be like Dark Confidant, and then board into just stuff that like works, stuff that's like I'm not afraid to cast it. So, however, we're kind of lucky here in that the opponent's deck is not. They've got Robber of the Rich, they've got Soulscar Mage, but they have also got a lot of like these cards that are more expensive. The Chandras, the Tormrans, the Goblin Chain Whirlers, and those are cards that are, I mean, super powerful. You got to deal with them, but at least like they give you a little bit more time than if the opponent was on a deck that had like the Javier Dominguez championship card. I forget what it's called now. Fervent Champion, I think it's called. Yeah, and you know, a bunch of like, you know, Burning Tree Emissary or something would be really, really tough to deal with. So, I mean, I don't know the opponent's deck list card for card or anything like that, but at least we have a little bit of a mid-range fight going on. However, our opponent is being really aggressive with our life total here, putting us right down to 13 on their second turn. And when we play this Cheville, it's like, I don't know, what was the right thing for them to do, you know? Get this Cheville off the table? Or should they have just gone right after our life total like that? I don't know. Kind of hard to tell. But it was a pretty aggressive line. Depends on the context of their hand, I guess. Chain Whirler plus Soulscar Mage, an interesting little combo here. And here we are trying to fetch a land, which is nice. This is something that's pretty cool about Witherbloom Command, is that, like, A, our life total is important. B, we want to hit land drops. So being able to do both those things is pretty nice here. I think I might have cost myself a life there by not blocking the Soulscar Mage with the Cheville. It's kind of hard to tell. I think that they would have used Play with Fire if they had it, no matter what. So they probably didn't have a 1-mana card to deal the last point of damage to the Cheville. I don't know. Maybe they had Spikefield Hazard. That's like something worth playing around, but and here we don't block because, yeah, our opponent casts a Lightning Strike on the Cheville, and we take 4. If we had blocked the Soulscar Mage, then they would have used a Lightning Strike on us, and we would have taken 5. So we're in a situation where we need to just get some of these cards out of our hand. Really up against the wall here. And I'm just kind of hoping to trade off with these 2 creatures. That's our goal. So the question is, do we play this Outland Liberator, or do we play Scavenging Ooze? Outland Liberator, not like... doesn't really do anything except is a 2/2 creature. But against this board, 2/2 creature looks pretty good. So we block Robber the Rich, and that puts the Frost Element back in their hand, but they don't have enough mana to cast it this turn. Bloodchief Stairs, great draw. So they play the Ferocidon. We get to get rid of that Ferocidon. Now we can gain life again. So now this Ooze is... we only got 1 mana, but like using that... or 1 green mana, but using that 1 green source every turn is going to be hard for them to race. This is why Scavenging Ooze is so good in this matchup. Like, it's not only gaining you life, it is also clocking them, and they have to get rid of it as soon as possible because you like it's just going to get bigger. And so Roiling Vortex, there was a little bit of a wrench into the plan. I would have liked to use my my green source with the Scavenging Ooze, but instead we can use this Witherbloom command to get rid of it. It's not going to... we're not going to be able to gain any life this turn, either from the command or the Ooze. But, well, we could if I was really feeling frisky. I could play the Stomping Ground untapped, and then get in for 3 here, and then on my opponent's upkeep gain a life and go up to 4. That just seems like it's, you know, playing with fire here. I'd rather just clock the opponent as fast as possible. Put the opponent to 7. Now they're Dobbs-Aroni here. They're going to need to draw something, and these removal spells in our hand that are left over just turn into like super tempo spells. And they pack it in. So, a couple of hands that were like pretty sketch, but the opponents didn't have the greatest of draws either themselves, not anything super fast. But the fact that we have a lot of stuff that's just cheap, easy to cast, gets to the board early. Scavenging Ooze turns a game around really fast, even though it's like a 2-mana spell. And when the game goes really late and you're just trying to do something to get the game over with, Lurrus helps you turn the corner really nicely. That helps out this kind of matchup a lot. If this like red deck, this real like life total pressure kind of deck, turns out to be really popular, maybe the 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Sign in Blood deck isn't where you want to be. But as it is, you know, like I've seen like on Twitter, like a few of these good red decks doing well in the format right now. But it's historic. There's just a ton of different stuff going on. You can't be like, oh well, I don't want to play this whole deck because of one matchup, because there's 20 different things out there that you're going to see any given time. So I do like in general these aggro matchups between Cheville, Ooze, a lot of cheap removal. So And if you can set your sideboard up well against this kind of thing, then you're going to be doing good. So let's go to the third match. All right, match number 3. 3 copies of Bloodthirsty Adversary. 1 land, 5/5 drop. Not really what we want to be doing. Sign in Blood on turn 2 into Bloodthirsty Adversary someday, and like nothing to affect the board. That's not the greatest hand in the world either, but at least it's something. And when the opponent plays Raugrin Triome on turn 2, it's like, okay, well, I don't have to worry that much about my life total. So instead of playing Cheville to try to play a little defense in anticipation of some opposing creatures, it's just like, okay, well, let me get this Sign in Blood resolved while I've got the chance, while I know it's going to resolve, because that's more or less what the game is going to be about. However, opponent played Hard Evidence, which is, first of all, a really good card, but also indicates a matchup that is, I don't know how hard it is, but this hand doesn't have anything to beat Indomitable Creativity. So we're going to be in some trouble here, potentially. This is a little thing, but I put a stop on my own end step. I'm going to eat my Cheville while my opponent doesn't have any mana untapped so that I can get out of range of Unholy Heat. And now I've got some leftover mana and nothing to do with it, so I don't think that my opponent's really got any kind of graveyard shenanigans going on in their deck. But every once in a while, people like to play a copy of Torrential Gearhulk. Of course, they're not going to do that in an Indomitable Creativity deck, but when I get the chance, I try to exile instants before I do anything else against a blue deck, because there's always a chance that they're going to have, Indomitable, or Torrential Gearhulk. But our opponent here, the inscription was nice, but we didn't have quite enough hand disruption here to do anything to stop this from happening. So, looks like we're toast. I could just pack it in here. Maybe that's what I should have done instead of showing the opponent that I had Bloodthirsty Adversary, but I don't think it's a huge deal. So sideboarding here, I don't like trying to bring in Fatal Push and any kind of instant speed removal spells to try to deal with the crab tokens and the treasure tokens and stuff that they're going to hit with their Indomitable Creativity to try to counter it. It's just not a very useful plan. Play with fire, Fatal Push. I just don't think that that's gonna work out. If you sit around with all these reactive spells in your hand, then they're just gonna be able to wait and then fire off a bigger Indomitable Creativity where X is higher than the amount of stuff you could have. Hard Evidence, 1 copy of Hard Evidence creates 2 targets for creativity, so it's just not a very good plan. A better plan is just try to load up on discard spells. It still is a combo deck in kind of a 5 mana combo, and so you can try to get rid of some of their combo pieces, either the things that make tokens, which isn't great because of Dwarven Mind or whatever, but or just try to get them to discard their Indomitable Creativities and make them play a fair game. But this is just kind of one of the things about, a combo control deck is going to be pretty tough to beat. However, a lot of our cards that are, the things we would want to bring in against control decks are the same things we want to bring in against combo decks. Right now I've only got 3 copies of Go Blank as extra discard spells, but if you wanted to, you could play Lurrus. You could play a 4th copy of Go Blank in your sideboard. I don't know, Inquisition, even though it doesn't hit the card. Actually, no, it does hit Indomitable Creativity. It's pretty good. All that stuff is a possibility if you're worried about combo or control or a deck like this that is kind of both. If you're more worried about the hand disruption aspect. So here, we do have a lot of hand disruption, which is pretty nice. I'm going to run this inscription into the Dovin's Veto, but we get to Thoughtseize them, and then take whatever their best card is. Shark Typhoon and Expressive Iteration are both really good, but I think Expressive Iteration in this particular scenario might be a little bit more dangerous for us. So another Thoughtseize off the top is great. What we can do here is Thoughtseize them, force them to fire off their Shark Typhoon, and then we get to decide if we want to Blood Chief Thirster or not. Like, they're going to have a target for creativity anyway with that Dwarven Mine, but we also, like, between this Go Blank and the Lightning Helix in their hand, we do need to worry about our life total a little bit. Or I guess not the Go Blank so much as that the cards that we have in our hand are not, like, going to be affecting the board. So, of course, and now we draw Sign in Blood, so it's like I would like to keep our life total as high as we can here. So the opponent's got a Lightning Helix. So that's something that we gotta watch out for. I think the thing to do here is play Lurrus and then get back Valky. I think I got pretty well got by the auto tapper here. Tapped out all my black mana, so I can't cast this Sign in Blood. So we get our value out of Lurrus, which is really nice. Even if they have the removal spell for the Lurrus, it's like, we get a little piece of value out of it. And at this point, I'm not that concerned about my life total. Going straight down to 5 is a little sketch, but we also would like to clock the opponent a little bit to try to prevent them from drawing into the cards they need. The other thing is that, like, I think that maybe blocking there is right, blocking that Valky and trading off with a token, but I was pretty happy, and I was kind of hoping, honestly, that the opponent would make that play. So they've got just a Hallowed Fountain in hand. So I'm trying to figure out what to do here. A lot of options when you have Kolaghan's Command and these creature lands. Getting the opponent down to, let's see, what, 9 here? That looks pretty appealing. It's getting our clock going. So there's a mine. So with the 1/1 in play, like, it doesn't look that appealing to just fire up the lair again, spend all our mana doing that, and just have him block. So what can we do? Well, if we Kolaghan's Command, nuke this token, and then we can get back a Valky. With the amount of mana we have now, we are threatening to be able to play it as a Planeswalker. We have some mana left over to pressure a little bit, because they're going to have to draw something. Next turn, we have lethal, just with the Lair, because they're at 6. So they draw Sarah's Emissary, which is something you have to worry about with this deck. You know, they're good at grinding out a game too, and it turns those Sarah's Emissaries that otherwise would be pretty, you know, bad combo pieces into something that they can actually cast and have an effect on the game. But because we had the Maelstrom Pulse and the Valky, it made it so that they had to choose either Planeswalkers or Sorceries, and then we were able to get rid of the Emissary. So, against some Jeskai decks and blue-white control decks and stuff like that, I'll bring in Cleansing Wildfire. Like, it's not really specifically for this match, or for that kind of matchup, but it works pretty nicely. Like, sometimes you run into opposing Field of Ruins, or opposing, like, Hall of the Storm Giants, or Castle Vantress, or even a flipped Search for Azcanta every once in a while. And so it's nice to have something that has a little bit of an effect against those cards. It draws you a card, so it helps you get through your deck a little bit. So here, this is kind of the hand we want, just a ton of discard spells, but Hard Evidence is just a really good card against us. Here, I go after their hand again, and I think it's the right play, but something I really didn't even think of was casting Maelstrom Pulse on these crabs. Kind of, as it turns out, would have been a better thing to do, because they were able to find their third red source and Indomitable Creativity between the top of their library and the card that they drew off of the clue. And so now we're in a situation where we've got to decide, am I going to pulse the Nezahal, or am I going to pulse the Hullbreaker Horror? And I think it's Nezahal, because the opponent is going to draw a bunch of cards otherwise. And then the trick here is that we have to hope that they just draw a blank the next 2 turns, or like this turn, and off of the Nezahal trigger, and we draw a land, which looks like is what has happened here, which is nice. So we play this adversary. Now we can pulse the Hullbreaker Horror. But they drew Dovin's Veto. So that's going to just about be the game. Yeah, so in hindsight, maybe, like, it's usually not right, like I was saying, to go after their tokens. But maybe that's the thing we should have done. But when the opponent only had, you know, was going down to no cards and needed to rip, we had another discard spell in the holster for the next turn. Like, it looks pretty appealing to try to get their hand empty. So, but them's the breaks. And as far as like Jeskai decks go, this is probably like the toughest one. As far, you know, like a normal control deck is. It's going to be a little bit easier to fight a fair game against. If the creativity decks kind of like gain in popularity, I think you might want to go up on like things like Duress, maybe a 4th Go Blank, And I don't know, possibly Soul Shatter is a card that I've been playing a little bit and works pretty nicely against Sarah's Emissary. Would have been great against Hullbreaker Horror and Nezahal for sure. So, well, not really. But anyway, so you can kind of change up your removal suite to hit what you think is going to be important. So that was the third match. Let's go to the fourth. Alright, this is the fourth match here. Hand looks good. We got some hand disruption if we want to, you know, if we're playing against a control deck. We got Cheville and removal if we're playing against an aggro deck. Is it Epiphany? Indicates more of a control kind of combo deck. So Thoughtseize is going to be good. What do we do against this hand? I don't know. But I don't think you're supposed to... If somebody's putting Stifle in their deck, I don't think you're supposed to just let them cast Stifle. Stifle plus Chance for Glory is kind of a combo. I mean, it's really not, because it's a 2-card combo, but whatever. And then I played a Cheville. Looking back, I don't really know if that's the right play here, but... because I could have Thoughtseized again and Thoughtseized away the Archmage's Charm. So the opponent does not counter the Thoughtseize, they draw 2 instead in response, which is a pretty common thing people do with Archmage's Charm in response to a Thoughtseize. But it's still kind of like, okay, well, we still get your best card. And then with some leftover mana here, we're going to cast Witherbloom Command, and it's pretty nice to blind flip the Baron more. So the opponent has access to Teferi. What this deck is it like a Lotus Field deck. Played against a couple of times on the ladder now. And it uses Teferi, who slows the Sunset to untap their Lotus Field. Uses Stifle to counter the Lotus Field trigger. It also uses the card Strict Proctor, which essentially counters the Lotus Field trigger. So they have a lot of mana. And then the Stifles are also good with Chance for Glory. Chance for Glory is also good with Gideon of the Trials, I believe it's called. And they also just have Archmage's Charm. Good card. So there's the Strict Proctor. So now the opponent here is in a bind where they have to decide if they want to -2 their Teferi or +1 to keep the loyalty high. And I'm trying to set it up so that they would lose their Teferi if they tried to use the -2 ability. So they can't try to dig for whatever other combo pieces they're looking for. I mean, combo pieces, but Lotus Field, whatever. Couldn't play the adversary there because of the Strict Proctor's ability. It says whenever a permanent entering the battlefield would trigger an ability, counter that ability unless its controller pays 2. So there, when the opponent drew the Lotus Field, they just didn't pay 2. so they didn't have to sacrifice the 2 lands. Kind of amazing that they made Lotus Field with hexproof and also made it so that it said when it enters the battlefield instead of as, so it uses the stack and can be interacted with Stifle, Strict Proctor, stuff like that. If it was just like, as this enters the battlefield, sacrifice 2 lands, then it would be quite a bit more palatable. Or if it didn't have hexproof. But, okay. So, the Bloodthirsty Adversary getting shut down by the Strict Proctor kind of sucks. So, what I'm planning on doing here is playing this Adversary, using it as just 2/2 haste, pressuring this Teferi, making them block. Like, it looks like they have a pretty nice clean block here on the Adversary. And now, hoping to resolve this Witherbloom command for a nice little 2-for-1 here to get back my Baron more and finish off the Strict Proctor. Could go for a creature land here, but I've already got a Lair in play and a Hive in hand, so I'm just going to go with Baron more again. So, they've got a lot of mana, but no way to, it looks like at least, no way to make this Chance for Glory happen. And with Teferi, who slows the sunset on 1, they're going to get some mana out of it, but like that's kind of it. So here's something that's interesting about Cheville. When you put a trigger, a Cheville counter, on a Planeswalker, and sometimes this happens with like Chandra, Torch of Defiance, other Planeswalkers that make mana. If you play a second copy of that same Planeswalker, and the first one goes to the graveyard, then you get your Cheville trigger anyway. So it kind of cuts off the play that the opponent made there. Of course, I mean, cuts off, like they were still able to do it, but so here my plan is to use the Inscription to make the opponent discard some cards. Now, with the Teferi on 2, they've got 1 card in hand. Something about their hand and kind of what they're doing here makes me think that it's Shark Typhoon. And so, in order to get this Teferi off the board, if it is a Shark Typhoon, we have to attack like this, so that if they block the Bloodthirsty Adversary with a Shark, then we would still get in 2 damage total on the Teferi and draw a card here, but it was Unholy Heat instead, which is way better for us. Of course, if it had been Settle the Wreckage, we would have been just absolutely blown out. So, good thing it wasn't that. And yeah, the opponent has a lot of mana available to them, and so we're just going to try to end this game as quickly as possible. This is the thing about this deck, though, is that, like, they have these combos set up to get their Lotus Field into play and to set up their Time Lock spell and stuff. But kind of at the end of the day, they are just a control deck. And, yeah, like, when they really needed to, of course, Niv Mizzet, the Perrin, is, like, really powerful. And that's, I think, kind of their end game. But, instead of trying stuff that could affect the board there, they do Stifle. So, getting into this late game scenario here, they have not a ton of stuff that, like, they're drawing a little bit more thin in this situation. And so, trying to figure out what to do here. We gotta, you know, whenever you have Kolaghan's coming in your hand, just so many options. Things I'm looking to try to get done here are destroy the Gideon, get my Cheville trigger, use the Kolaghan's command to discard the opponent's card, right? Because of Memory Deluge, you know it's a pretty good one, right? And it was, in fact, it was Archmage's Charm. And now we can attack. See, I think I might have... This might have been a mistake. Maybe I was supposed to shock in the land there and use Hive and to remove the Memory Deluge and get in for a little bit more damage. But either way, this is fine, and we've got some mana available to us in case they draw like another Memory Deluge. We can eat it with an Ooze. I guess you never know. Like, this could be a deck that has Torrential Gearhulk in it pretty easily, so... And actually, yeah, it works out really nicely here. So they draw Unholy Heat, and we have enough green mana to take them off of Delirium, because the only sorcery that they've got in their graveyard is Expressive Iteration. And so now we're just trying to close this game out in 2 turns. Situation like this, I don't want to play the Lurrus. Like, I know it like lowers the clock a little bit, but so does spending your mana on the Hive. And if they were to have like a Wrath of God here, I would want to be able to play the Lurrus and kind of rebuild the board quickly. So, unfortunately, you can't bring in Cleansing Wildfire against Lotus Field, which is just abysmal, really. It's just such a bad design. So they have this, you know, this thing that's like just impossible to interact with. And so, similarly to the Indomitable Creativity deck, we're just going to board in a bunch of hand disruption to make it so they can't get off that combo as easily. But unlike the Indomitable Creativity deck, when they have Lotus Field plus Stifle, or they have Lotus Field plus Strict Proctor, the game kind of continues, whereas Indomitable Creativity, you just lose, you know? So we're just going to try to battle them with a good old mid-range fight here. This hand is okay. Bloodthirsty Adversary in your opener isn't what you are really looking for. Bloodshie's Thirst off the top, of course, also not really what you're looking for, but it does hit Stern Proctor, which is important. Could have played Thoughtseize there instead of the Ooze. I don't know. I worry a lot about getting my mana, like, using as much mana as possible. Like, we didn't play anything on turn 1. We would have wasted another mana on turn 2 there if we had played Thoughtseize. And just getting something on the board is, like, a little bit useful. Even if it's something like Scavenging Ooze that's, like, not very threatening, just to cast on turn 2 with no graveyards or whatever. It's still just, like, you know, made our opponent play Gideon and use the plus ability instead of the minus, or the, I guess it's the 0 ability to get the emblem, you know, or do something different with their mana on turn 3 there. So all of that being the case, I think it's important to get as much, to utilize as much of your mana as you can. So here, I could have Thoughtseize before I attacked, just in case I hit a creature. but I was more interested in trying to draw out a removal spell on the ooze so that I could resolve this Thoughtseize without having to worry about Archmage's Charm. But if I I would have missed out on a point of damage there if I had taken Thoughtseize, taken Niv Mizzet or a different creature, and then been put a plus and pulse encounter on the ooze because I ate it. So now they have to just play the Lotus Field fair here, but they're going to have the Teferi to give themselves a bunch of mana. Again, I'm going to go after instants in their graveyard. Another thing you want to do is try to play around Unholy Heat. Now, I don't have any way to increase the toughness of the ooze anyway, but I think that's worth doing. And so we know three of the four cards in our opponent's hand. If we let them untap with this Teferi, it can be really bad. So I'm going to gamble here and go after the Teferi with the Hive and hopefully attack it down. But it is risky because if they have Unholy Heat in their hand, then they just heat the ooze and then draw a million cards. So definitely don't want that. But they didn't have it that turn. So we're in the clear a little bit. All right. And so here we're going to see something really cool about Bloodthirsty Adversary that gives it a pretty significant leg up against other, I guess, cards that have, Kicker and stuff you can pump more mana into, is that we're going to cast this. If the opponent uses Archmage's Charm to counter it, then we don't have to pay the extra 3 mana to activate his ability, right? If this was a card that just said Kicker, or Multi-Kicker or whatever, we'd have to pay a bunch of mana, get it countered, whatever, and then... but now we have 3 mana left over, which is pretty nice when you have Lurrus in your deck. It makes it so that, when you try to cast an adversary and they counter it, you are always going to have something useful to do with the 3 mana left over. And if they counter it, then your Bloodthirsty Adversary is just going to, get cast again next turn. So they finally get the ooze off the board. Yeah, they had Stifle for the adversary, which is great because it's a 2/2 haste for 2 mana and took a card out of their hand. Especially it's Stifle is a pretty useful card for them. But now we are in a situation where we can't attack into the Settler Wreckage. The Teferi is looking really good for them. So I don't want to fire up a creature land and try to attack the Teferi down. So I play Lurrus as a bait spell for another counterspell. In hindsight, I'm pretty sure this was really bad. Because well, yeah, the shark is really good for them here. think I was supposed to just bite the bullet and play the Bloodchief's Thirst and hope that they didn't have anything too bad for us in response. But now they've got a ton of mana and a Leer, so, you know, letting them untap with Lotus Field plus Teferi is just like kind of asking for trouble. I mean, you can't really, I don't know, this isn't like a deck that's very common. You can't be like, oh, well, I should have known to play around Leer Disciple of the Drowned, but, you know, whatever they were going to do with that much mana wasn't going to be very good for us. So now the Ooze is gone, so the Leer is just like ready to go. Any of these counter spells in their graveyard are going to be a lot of trouble. So I draw Inscription of Ruin, and I make a pretty significant mistake here. What I should have done is use the Inscription as a bait spell by targeting Scavenging Ooze. But instead I chose to make them discard cards, which normally is going to be like, yeah, I'll spend my mana, counter your Inscription to protect my hand. But instead their hand is just like, with Leer in play, that doesn't do anything, so it was a pretty big mistake. If I had like targeted the Scavenging Ooze in the graveyard, then I could have started to go to work on the cards in their graveyard. And then, I'm sorry, I'm saying all this stuff. I think the Ooze was gone anyway. Okay. I guess I could have targeted a Bloodthirsty Adversary, and maybe that would have gotten the cards out of their graveyard, or would have caused them to tap their mana, and then I could Bloodchief's Thirst the Leer, and then hopefully do something with that. But anyway, well, first of all, if I need to not screw up like that anymore. But second, it's just always going to be really tough when you're playing with basically you're playing with fair cards and they're playing like unfair cards. You know, they're Shark Typhoons and Leers and Teferis and stuff are going to just be gaining them a bunch of card advantage every turn. This looks like a pretty solid hand, though. Looking back, like, I like having Inscription of Ruin and Sign in Blood in the same hand sometimes when you're playing against a deck that doesn't play to the board very much, because, like, Inscription of Ruin, while it's great, it takes away their two worst cards or whatever, but like when you're Sign in Blooding as well, you're really playing into the card quantity factor of this matchup. Trying to really like reduce the amount of resources they have and maximize the amount that you have. Okay, so the opponent is on two lands. And so one thing that's nice about having Inscription of Ruin and Go Blank out of the sideboard as your disruption spells, and playing this game of card quantity when we try to be disruptive here, is that thought seizing an opponent who's stuck on two lands, using your mana to take one of their cards, is a really bad play. It's just like not a very useful thing to be doing. But when you are taking out multiple of their cards every turn, it turns into something that's like much more effective. The opponent drew a Strict Proctor, so they're able to get their Lotus Field combo. But we had the answer for it, and we can, with Cheville in play, get to kind of punish them for casting a creature. And again, I'm just going to go straight up to 4 toughness here. Get out of range of things like Lightning Helix, Unholy Heat, all that kind of stuff. And we know about the Settle the Wreckage, so we don't have to attack into it. Right, the opponent could have used that Settle the Wreckage on the Ooze, but maybe it would be useful, maybe not. Niv Mizzet. So, like I said, I usually try to get rid of instants in my opponent's graveyard. You also want to worry about like Unholy Heat. So I got rid of the 1 Planeswalker. The thing is that like you never really know when you're going to have excess mana again, so you do just need to be careful about, a little bit methodical about like what you're hitting with your Ooze when you're doing that kind of thing. So now the opponent is tapped out from Settle the Wreckage mana, so we can just kind of go ham here, attack with both creatures. And so now the opponent has Teferi here, and they have to choose between getting a card or holding up Settle. But having drawn a 7th land here, now we can start to do Tibalt Cosmic Imposter stuff. This is the reason why we play 1 copy of Basic Swamp, but when you draw the Swamp, you don't get any lands. Not actually Settle the Wreckage specifically, but like Field of Ruin, Cleansing Wildfire, Assassin's Trophy, all those kinds of cards. So we don't get any value there, but it's still just like a 1-for-1 removal spell because I didn't attack with both creatures. Kind of forced them to play to Settle there anyway. We're going to get Tibalt up to 9. Now we have Unholy Heat and Maelstrom Pulse to get rid of the Teferi. There's plenty of answers to the Teferi here. And what I'm hoping to have happen here is our opponent to counter the Unholy Heat with some kind of counterspell and then resolve the Kolaghan's Command. So, you know, that would be great. So we're going to wait till their upkeep. Instead they just let that resolve. Probably don't have a counterspell. But we get our Cheville trigger. Cheville's looks pretty good because they keep having to put stuff on the board, either the Niv Mizzet or the Teferi or whatever, and we get to kind of keep our cards flowing, because like if you just use removal spell, it's kind of a pretty bad situation to try to just like one-for-one remove things like Planeswalkers, Niv Mizzet. And so if that's the case, then also avert your eyes. This is brutal. Could have played around it, but didn't. Like casting this Go Blank first, but like I just wanna get that -9, you know? Or -8. So thoroughly owned here by our opponent. So against a deck like this, where they are more focused on like presenting pretty big threats, Teferi's, Niv Mizzets, Hullbreaker Horrors, whatever, I don't mind leaving in Cheville, even though it's not the greatest matchup for them, for Cheville, because I want to be gaining some card advantage back after, you know, when you Maelstrom Pulse an opposing Niv Mizzet, that is like a card advantage negative play. That is a card disadvantage play. But with Cheville around, then it turns into something that's a little bit more palatable. So I don't mind having Cheville, whereas against, you know, like the pure blue-white or blue-white-red control decks, Cheville is just like a liability. I don't want to draw it. So eventually got there, got ourselves into a situation where they could have come back with that that ridiculous Tibalt situation, but either way, like Tibalt being +2 a couple of times is usually also going to be enough to win a game on a board that's pretty stable like that. So either way, we were able to finally get there. But yeah, interesting deck. As far as matchups go, though, the field of like Lotus Field decks just are pretty bad. I've found for this style of deck. But you know, I mean, I guess that's one thing about this strategy is that like you still just have a bunch of Thoughtseizes and Inscription of Ruins and whatever, and sometimes you can still just kind of piece together enough damage to win. Everything's kind of versatile, so even though it's not, you know, Maelstrom Pulse isn't like super efficient or whatever, it's just like you can kind of piece together a win here and there. So one more match. Okay, 5th match here. Here's a hand that's clearly a mulligan. This hand's looking a little better. Again, we've got our you know, Blooming Marsh on turn 1 to Thoughtseize. Turn 2, play a tapped land, Thoughtseize again. So the Veil not being very good on turn 2 isn't going to like really affect us that much. Zagoth Triome, it's just always going to be bad. But 2 Thoughtseizes against this opponent is kind of what you're looking for. Lots of times I guess I don't know about lots of times, but when you're mulliganing, Thoughtseize effects aren't the greatest thing sometimes. I don't want to be trading 1 for 1 when I'm already down a card. But when I didn't have any other turn 1 or 2 plays, it was like the thing to do is just like make sure that I can cast some stuff on the 1st and 2nd turn rather than try to put back one of my Thoughtseizes after a mulligan. So I guess I wouldn't say that I'll very often put back Thoughtseizes when I mulligan, but it's still just kind of like not when you've mulliganed and your opponent hasn't. That's not the time when Thoughtseize is at its best. And so, yeah, I just want it with Inscription in hand. What you want to do is just, like, in a matchup like this, just take as much of their mana ramp away as possible, and then strand those expensive cards in their hand, and then you can make them discard them. You know, all these really powerful things that they have where they're just like way over the top cards you can't beat, like Omniscience, whatever. If they can't cast them, then you're in the clear. You know, you have to set them up for like not being able to cast them on time, getting rid of them with your discard spells, and then trying to close the game out before they can, you know, draw into some of those really big, powerful things. So, having said that, opponent is having no problem getting up to 7 mana for Emergent Ultimatum, and I got pretty good by the auto tapper there. Wasn't paying attention. And so, like I was saying before, you know, the deck that we just played against in the last round is basically a mid-range deck, but because it has a bunch of like this mana acceleration sub-theme, it becomes a really problematic matchup because all of their stuff, all of their mid-range kind of cards are just going to be way more powerful than us because they are just like not worried about how much they cost, right? So this is another matchup just like the last one that is going to be pretty rough, but they are still just like a deck that is like has a lot of, I mean, not even a lot, but like more than one, like, you know, facet of itself going on. Like they need to be able to ramp and cast their big stuff, right? And so you have a little bit of a game plan to be able to pick apart with your Thoughtseizes and your discard spells. So we just want to get a little bit of a clock on now. At any point the opponent draws Emergent Ultimatum, we're just toast. So we need to try to close this game out as quickly as possible. It's looking like we got four damage a turn. So they need to whiff for 3 more turns. Shadow's Verdict is a card that is like we're not thrilled to see, but honestly could have been a lot worse. So, yeah, we're in a situation right now where we just have to hope that they just draw really poorly. Again, this could be a deck that plays Torrential Pure Hulk. They have plenty of instants between Fatal Push, Growth Spiral. So I don't mind kind of trying to clear out some of their instants. But they don't have any other creatures. The Shadow's Verdict removing the creatures from the graveyard has been pretty important here. So the Castle Vantress is going to make this really hard. Like, I was feeling pretty good about my chances until the Vantress. Now they have up to 2 Scry 2s to try to get out of this. No creatures in my graveyard because of the Shadow's Verdict. Trying to figure out if there's anything, like, any reason to, like, Bloodchief's Thirst my ooze and then return it with the Inscription of Ruin? Does that do anything? No, clearly. Just trying to... just trying to make sure there's nothing we can really do here. Now the opponent is going to go into the tank quite a while on this Castle of Antris, which is interesting, because usually it's like, this thing keeps me alive or wins the game. Versus doesn't, you know? So it means that the opponent has like a pretty interesting decision to make here. They know pretty well the contents of our hand, so it's like, okay, and then they eventually decide to top 2 cards. So something fishy's going on. So I'm worried mostly about Shark Typhoon, right? Because they kept both cards, so they're expecting to be able to draw into that second card. And so if it's Shark Typhoon, I want to be able to cast Thoughtseize, have them cycle the shark in response, take whatever they drew, and then use a removal spell on the token. But instead, they had Sublime Epiphany, which is a pretty nice one. So we are set back quite a ways here, but I know that I don't want my opponent to cast whatever card they had on top there. So I went ahead and used the Inscription. Like there's a, like it wasn't going to be Ultimatum, but it could have been something really good, I guess. It could have been a removal spell, Fatal Push, I don't know. And then they drew a Fatal Push for a turn, so now we're in some trouble. They kind of have free reign with that Castle of Antris over there. So they cast Final Parting and go get Golos, which is a really interesting choice to me. Because they know we have this Bloodchief's Thirst in our hand. I mean, if we have another discard spell, like another Thoughtseize or Inscription, then going to fetch up an Emergent Ultimatum doesn't really do very much for them, but still, like, Golos into go get World Tree and then not do anything is kind of setting yourself up to get hit by that Bloodchief's Thirst. And now they're scrying on their upkeep to try to use, you know, get some kind of removal spell or something for this ooze, and they only find land. So we just barely made it out of that one. And so this is a matchup that's tough because that Elder Gargaroth that we saw, that's going to be like, if that thing survives, like we can set up, our deck is set up to be able to beat a card like Elder Gargaroth pretty nicely, but this is a matchup where you don't want to be just like playing a bunch of reactive spells, right? Cheville into Maelstrom Pulse or something doesn't do anything when your opponent is just casting Cultivates into Emergent Ultimatum, right? So I don't want to be leaving a bunch of Bloodchief Thirst and Maelstrom Pulses in my deck after sideboard. However, that Elder Gargaroth is like really scary, so we have to be able to respect it a little bit. So it makes the sideboarding decisions here pretty tough. But I don't, usually it's Maelstrom Pulse. It's just like not that bad. They've got the Gargaroth, of course, but they also have like a Golos. Narset is like, also it's necessary to get rid of. Don't know what other kinds of creatures they might have, so leaving in some amount of removal is going to be fine. Here's a hand that looks pretty good. I mean, we're not doing anything until turn 3, but it does kind of do everything we want, So now we can start firing off these inscriptions, make them discard cards. Again, we're in another situation where, the opponent is stuck on lands, and if these were Thoughtseizes or Duresses, they would be like, okay, but the opponent isn't even like doing anything, so it doesn't matter if they're discarding 1 card per turn, but discarding 2 cards per turn is going to make it so that when they finally draw a land, they don't have anything good to cast. It doesn't really matter which cards it is that we're taking. And now this Bloodthirsty Adversary is just like, it's go time, Now we are really getting after their hand. And so, like I had mentioned before, like, Bloodthirsty Adversary is going to be able to flash back Go Blank. So even though we have only 3 copies of Go Blank in the sideboard, we drew 1 and an adversary, so we get to cast it twice. And now we get to take away their whole graveyard, take away their whole hand. They can't do any shenanigans with, like, Scholar of the Lost Trove or whatever. So it's looking pretty good here. Our problem is that it's still a matchup where, we've got these leftover discard spells, right? We've got this leftover Thoughtseize. Any inscriptions that we draw are going to be pretty useless. And if they just draw, say, like a Cultivate into another land, into an Emergent Ultimatum, which is like a pretty reasonable set of cards to have in the top of their library, then we still just lose. And this random Wall of Blossoms is like completely shutting us down. And now it's like, well, I don't even want them to get to 6 mana because we know that they have an Alrund's Epiphany lined up. So, as well as this game has gone, we're still like not out of the woods yet. That's why this matchup is just like so hard. But trying to figure out what to do here. We've got a Hive, we've got a Lair. But this Wall of Blossoms is really putting us in a bind here. We could do something along the lines of like pulse the Wall of Blossoms and eat it, and then like eat it with the ooze, and then attack for 2 more with the Lair. But this is kind of like a huge waste of a Maelstrom Pulse when we know that they're going to have 2 copies of they're going to have 2 bird tokens in play next turn. And, 2 new cards. But it's like, also kind of wanting to give myself the ability to play Sign in Blood on the opponent, possibly for the last 2 points. So we found a Bloodchief's Thirst, which is really nice. Got rid of that wall. Getting in for some damage now. And now the opponent has Shadow's Verdict. Leaving themselves dead to a creature land, so clearly it means they have Fatal Push. So we just knock it out with Thoughtseize and get in for the last 3 points. So, you know, the opponent didn't have a ton of mana there and had to spend a lot of turns like sitting around doing nothing, spinning their wheels, but kind of even if they had, we drew so much discard that like if they had played more lands, they would have been like almost worse off because we would have just let them have land but then taken out their spells. So as long as you can, you know, get a little bit of a board presence there, it's kind of anemic beatdowns there with the Wall of Blossoms like really putting a wrench in our plan. But had just enough to try to get that one. And yeah, a bad matchup by all means. Like, you do not want to be running into that all the time, but still, it's just like, you play enough Thoughtseizes, cheap creatures, like, less things can go wrong for you than can for the opponent, and you're just kind of always going to have a chance, you know? So, let's bring it back to the deck and wrap it up. Okay, so to wrap up here, taking a look at this deck one more time, you can see that, like, the Sign in Blood was really good in the matchups where our life total wasn't under a lot of pressure. Historic is a format that's like kind of all over the place, but one thing that I guess I've found is that your life total isn't under that much pressure most of the time. And in fact, like even a lot of the aggressive decks, things like Selesnya Company decks or like Affinity or like Merfolk and Elves, I don't know. A lot of the creature decks out there aren't really putting a ton of pressure on your life total, and with Cheville in the mix, you can really keep your life total high enough to leverage Sign in Blood and getting a bunch of card advantage off of your opponent casting small creatures. So even though we're just using a bunch of 1-for-1 removal spells, like, we're getting to the board quickly, we're drawing a bunch of extra ones so that we can, you know, do more than just 1-for-1 removal. We can, yeah, just keep our life total high. You know, I feel like a lot of times I deal more damage to myself than my opponents do between Shock Lance and Thoughtseize and Sign in Blood. And it's just kind of the way the format works. However, we did run into that one red deck where it's like, okay, Sign in Blood is a liability here. But even then, we still have a lot of life gain packed into this deck between Lurrus, Cheville, Scavenging Ooze, Witherbloom Command. So, as long as you can, you know, stay on the board early, I think you're going to be okay with a deck like this. Even if Sign in Blood is geared more towards a longer game plan. The sideboard came up huge. You know, these knockout blow kind of 3-mana cards go really, really well with the Bloodthirsty Adversary. This is the exact kind of deck that just gets like way better after game 2 and 3 because you get to bring in really powerful sideboard cards, and the opponent just kind of doesn't. Like, there isn't that much that the opponent can do against us. The deck doesn't, like, in a weird way, it doesn't do anything that well, so that means it doesn't do anything that's, like, exploitable. We saw one opponent try to bring in Rest in Peace, and of course it didn't, like, it was very late in the game when they actually cast it, but, like, it just doesn't really do that much. You'll have plenty of games where, like, I could Witherbloom Command my opponent's Rest in Peace, or I could Maelstrom Pulse my opponent's, like, Leyline of the Void or whatever, but it just doesn't matter. Like, I can just transition into, like, okay, Bloodthirsty Adversary is just 2/2 haste now, and Lurrus is just 3/2 lifelink. I don't have to play with these with the graveyard shenanigans. And so that's something that you're going to run into. Like, people are going to bring in graveyard hate, and there are going to be some people on the ladder that are prepared for graveyard shenanigans happening. And you get to basically decide like how hard you want to lean into your graveyard stuff and open yourself up to potential graveyard hate cards. And what's nice about this deck versus other decks that have Lurrus is that I'm not that concerned about any of the graveyard hate stuff. Like, you can just play a totally fair game and not worry about it. And the other thing about Lurrus is that, you know, because like we're not that focused on the graveyard, we are still like plenty able to make use of the graveyard. Another thing about Lurrus in this deck is that the companion mechanic is just so good in a mid-range deck where I'm trying to Inscription of Ruin my opponent's hand, right? I'm trying to like cast Mind Rot, I'm trying to cast Divination, right? I want to just have like card quantity battles with my opponent. And so when you have Lurrus in your deck, you're already a card up on that. And it doesn't matter that it's basically a 6-mana 3/2 lifelink, right? Like 6-mana Kitchen Finks or something. It's just that it's a card. And if the opponent doesn't have any cards and you have Lurrus, like you're going to win, right? So the companion mechanic works in a mid-range deck like this just phenomenally well. So, and I do like how the sideboard is built right now, but they're, you know, I'm recording this right in the middle of the Players Championship or something. I don't really know what it's called, but an important tournament, and where they're playing Historic, and so that's probably bound to shake up the metagame a little bit, but there's still tons of flexibility here. I know what I like right now is the stuff over here, the Cleansing Wildfires, the Crush the Weak, the Go Blanks, and then these little you know, Fatal Pushes, Valky, Outland Liberator. But all of that stuff is up in the air. You can make this, you know, tailor-made for whatever it is that you're running into. These Cleansing Wildfires are always going to be on the chopping block if the 5-color Nizit deck isn't seeing a lot of play. So, yeah, so having said all of that, you know, I recorded these games, and then I recorded the voiceover part here that I'm doing now. And then today I'm recording the voiceover part, but I have the mic on. So it's probably going to be a little bit better. But in that span of time, Wizards announced the Alchemy format and, you know, set releases and changes to Arena. And so I don't know what the future holds for Historic and the format at large. I really hope that Wizards kind of like comes to their senses and makes it so Historic doesn't have to play with nerfed and buffed cards. Like, you know, I've been basically working on this deck for a year and a half, or maybe more, and it's a little scary to think that just like at any given time, a bunch of these cards are just going to like be totally different. You know, I might wake up in the morning and Scavenging Ooze costs 3, or Lurrus is a 2/1. Or Bloodchief Thirst only hits 1-drops or something like that. So I don't know. It's a really scary proposition for this kind of like plan of building one deck and just iterating on it a million times until you have it like really nailed down and tons of practice on it. So yeah, as far as the future holds for Historic, I don't know if I can really say that I'm going to be doing a lot more of this deck, but hopefully either they decide to not do this Alchemy program the way they've said they are, or else maybe it's just not as bad as it seems like it's going to be. But either way, I appreciate everybody watching. And I think if the Alchemy program really does screw up everything, then I'm going to go back to playing Magic Online and playing Modern, which looks like it's pretty fun right now. I'm hearing that you can play good old boomer Jund Midrange in Modern to some pretty good success. So I like the sounds of that. So you can check out my blog. It's at jundlife.blogspot.com, and my Twitch channel is just twitch.tv/GriffinLucier. And appreciate everybody watching, and I'll see you next time.